Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Foundry by Forge College. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here for another explainer. So, we're coming right off the heels of our last lesson where we gathered some really incredible raw metrics. But let's be real for a second. Raw data just sitting in a folder on your desktop, it's about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Today, we're transitioning from simply measuring network efficiency to actually framing a concrete capstone project. We're going to lock in our research questions and define some very measurable goals centered squarely on Gulfstream's role in transaction processing. Right, so here is our engineering blueprint for today. We're going to start with the capstone transition, move into Gulfstream mechanics, check out a highway traffic metaphor, map our metrics, walk through a 6-step workflow, and finally wrap up with designing your research plan. Okay, let's jump straight in. Section 1, the capstone transition, from data to evaluation. Now, to successfully evaluate all our data, we absolutely have to define our capstone scope. And scope is really just a boundary. Think of it as this sturdy, protective wall separating a beautifully tight, testable question from, well, vague, unmeasurable research that's ultimately just going to leave you crying over a spreadsheet at 3 a.m. Establishing these clear questions and metrics right out of the gate is crucial. It keeps your capstone from sinking. Honestly, if you don't draw this boundary early on, you'll literally drown in a sea of data without ever actually proving a point. All right, let's dive into this. Section 2, Gulfstream mechanics. Let's understand forwarding. So, it is shockingly easy, even for seasoned researchers, to completely confuse what a thing actually does with what we want it to achieve. For example, a mechanism question asks what Gulfstream is physically doing under the hood, right? Things like proactively forwarding transactions. But an outcome question asks about the result we actually care about, like reduced inclusion latency. If you mix these two up, you might spend weeks proving the engine is running perfectly while completely ignoring that the car is still parked in the driveway. We have to separate the mechanism from the outcome to build a valid test. Moving on to Section 3, the highway traffic metaphor, getting into dynamic routing. The fundamental question we need to ask here is, how does Gulfstream actually route all this traffic without causing massive network crashing congestion? If you look at a traditional broadcast mempool, it's basically like every single car trying to merge onto a single lane road at the exact same time. It's total chaos. Horns blaring, tempers flaring, literally nobody moving. But Gulfstream doesn't do that. So how exactly does it manage the flow? Well, let's map this out visually. Imagine our transactions are vehicles on a highway. The validators, they are the on-ramps, and the upcoming leader slot is our toll booth. Instead of just dumping everyone into a single chaotic lane, Gulfstream uses those validator on-ramps to dynamically route cars to open toll booths way before they even arrive. It completely smooths out the flow and avoids that infuriating last-minute rush. But think about this. What happens if the leader's schedule changes? Well, that's like the toll booth suddenly packing up and moving 5 miles down the road. The cars have to be dynamically rerouted on the fly. Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is how we map this all out. Section 4, mapping metrics to goals. Here is exactly how we translate our metaphorical traffic conditions into hard, testable data. We track 4 key metrics. First, forwarding rate. That's how many vehicles are on-ramps successfully routed early. Then, time to first leader. Basically, how long the car drove before hitting the toll booth line. Next is inclusion latency, which is the total trip time from leaving home to actually paying the toll. And finally, re-forward count. This tracks how many times a car had to be rerouted because, the toll booth moved. Every single routing mechanism in Gulfstream directly causes one of these specific outcomes. And here is the absolute magic phrase for your project: causality chain. You cannot just wave your hands and say, oh, Gulfstream makes things fast. No way. You have to prove the domino effect. Domino 1, the forwarding rate increases. This directly hits domino 2, the time to first leader decreases. And that hits domino 3, overall inclusion latency falls. A successful mechanism has to trigger that intermediate step before it ever impacts your final outcome. Your capstone project must prove this exact, deeply satisfying chain of falling dominoes. Let's move on and see how this all builds together in Section 5, the 6-step workflow. To actually execute this capstone, we're going to use a very specific 6-step workflow. Step 1, you define your question. 2, form a hypothesis. 3, select your metrics. 4, set success criteria. 5, anticipate confounders, things like a random network latency spike or a misbehaving CPU. And 6, produce your deliverables. Across the advanced Web3 programs at Forge College, we utilize this exact empirical workflow because it forces absolute clarity. It takes a loose, casual curiosity about Gulfstream and transforms it into a rock-solid professional research project. Check out the specific phrasing of our hypothesis here. Median inclusion latency will decrease by at least 15%. It is absolutely crucial to embed a specific, testable numerical threshold into your work. It has to be a pass or fail. If you just say, latency will decrease, well, you haven't given yourself a measurable target. You're just kind of guessing in the dark. Putting a hard 15% in there gives your capstone some real teeth, making it a rigorous scientific test instead of just, a loose opinion. Okay, bringing it all together now. Section 6, designing your research plan. To properly lock in our plan, we're going to hold the transaction arrival rate constant. We'll exclude leader CPU spikes, and we're going to totally ignore cross-region WAN delays. Now, a lot of beginners look at this and think constraints are just limitations that make their research weaker. Actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. Constraints are your best instruments. Bounding your scope like this makes your work tractable and highly defensible. Think about it. If you don't mathematically constrain the downstream traffic in your test, you can't actually prove that the routing is what worked. So, here are your immediate next steps before our next session. I need you to gather all the concrete artifacts you produced in our previous lesson. Grab those CSV exports, get your validator forward logs ready, and do a quick review of your previous report slide deck. You are going to need all of this prepped and ready to go for our next topic, which is designing data collection for transaction analysis. So the stage is perfectly set. You understand the mechanism, you've built out your causality chain, and you've drawn the hard boundaries of your scope. The only question left is, are you ready to actually track your transactions from the on-ramp all the way down to the toll booth? Go gather your data, because it is time to prove your causal chain and apply this knowledge practically. And that's a wrap on framing the Gulfstream capstone. I really hope this explainer gave you a crystal clear roadmap for structuring your research going forward. If you want to dive deeper into this subject or honestly just explore a ton of other really fascinating Web3 topics, make sure to visit forge.college to check out all the amazing educational resources there. Keep questioning, keep measuring, and I will see you in the next explainer.